Welcome to the Clause 8 podcast. I've been doing this for 8 years. I've been recording the Clause 8 podcast. I recorded my first episode the day before the election, 2016, and I'll get to why that's interesting. But in all of these 8 years, I've been mostly interviewing guests. In a few episodes, I did share my views on stuff, but usually it takes me a long time to think about it, decide what I'm going to talk about, and then do it. But when I saw the news on January 20th that Coke Morgan Stewart was selected as the acting director of the USPTO, at the risk of embarrassing myself, I'll tell you, I was so excited I jumped up. Eventually I said, I got to record a Clause 8 episode talking about why I'm so excited about this choice. Regardless of what your views are about other issues or about the government as a whole, I don't think anybody could look at the last few weeks about what's going on in government and be fully happy with what they've seen. But I guess for me, seeing Coke Morgan Stewart being chosen for that role in that little corner of the government, which I know best, the IP and patent world, it's heartening to see that the best person suited for that role was chosen to lead the USPTO. Before I discuss why that is, I want to go back to me recording that episode the day before the 2016 election. The person I interviewed first for my podcast the day before the 2016 election, when Trump was unexpectedly elected, he thought he might be able to become the USPTO director. So I've been closely watching the process ever since and how that kind of works. The possibilities are endless, unlike in some of the other positions in government where there's almost a short list of heir apparents for maybe the antitrust or in their various national security roles. It might be a much smaller kind of possibilities. For a USPTO director, anybody can become a USPTO director, and it's been interesting to watch how that happens. For example, for a historical perspective, when I talked to David Kapos, he said the reason he got chosen for that role is because he knew Gary Locke, who was chosen as Commerce Secretary, and they had a working relationship, and Gary Locke had a high opinion of him, and he recommended him to the Obama administration, and that's how he got chosen. Another choice, the last one, is Andrei Yanko, right? I believe the congressman who introduced him in his hearings shared that story, but the congressman from Pennsylvania, I believe Mike Kelly, I believe his daughter-in-law worked for Ireland Manila, and she introduced Yanko to him, and Mike Kelly was one of the early supporters of Trump, and he recommended Andrei Yanko for the role of USPTO director. But as you can remember, if you remember that time, there was hundreds of different names thrown out. And obviously the Commerce Secretary, as I talked on my last episode with David Boundy, the Commerce Secretary, whoever that is, it's one of the agencies that he oversees, and he obviously plays a big role in that. This time around, everybody was asking me, who do you think will be the USPTO director? One of the people that I was going to have on that list was going to be Coke Morgan Stewart, and she was going to be right on top of that list. And the reason I thought of her is because she spent a lot of time at the USPTO, and she had very senior leadership roles. When she left the USPTO, she ended up serving in Governor Youngkin's administration, leading a big government agency, so she very well qualified from all fronts. So I had her on top of my mind as somebody, hey, she'd be perfect for that role. But when I discussed her with other people in the IP world, everybody had a kind of a very similar reaction. It was interesting. Everybody said, she'd be great, but she's too nice to position herself to get that role. So I guess when everybody was telling me that, I was like, yeah, she might be just too nice. Obviously, when the election happened, I reached out to some people I knew who were involved in other parts of the transition. I said, hey, let me know if you hear anything about this USPTO, and they were amused because obviously this was not a priority for the transition. But the fact that I think Howard Lutnick, who led the transition process, as I talked with my conversation with David Boundy, and that he was chosen to be the Commerce Secretary and that he's intimately involved in patents, I'm sure he has pretty strong vision and he knows how to run things well. So I wouldn't be surprised, and I guess I hope that is the case, that actually Coke Morgan Stewart, even though she's being named acting director, that she is going to be nominated and confirmed for that position. Why do I think that she was so perfect for this role? In addition to things that I mentioned, actually, full disclosure, I hope she doesn't mind me saying it, but Coke told me that she's been a long-time listener of Clause 8, and she's been very supportive of what we tried to do here. But I'm trying to be unbiased as possible in light of that. But the thing I took from that is that I really appreciate when everybody reaches out to me. But a lot of times, they reach out to me when somebody they know was on the podcast, and they tell me they enjoyed that episode. She reached out to me when it's people across the spectrum very different point of views. And it stood out to me. It stood out to me that she was very interested in what everybody had to say, and that she really deeply cared about the IP system and the patent system. And I had a list of people, like I was going to show a list of people. I think all of those people that I had in mind would have been great choices. And I think they shared a few qualities in common. One of the qualities that they shared is that they were all familiar with how the USPTO actually operates, right? There's one thing to be actually a successful patent attorney and I guess know how to do your job well for clients in terms of dealing with the patent office or dealing with a portion of the patent office that you deal with, whatever it is. It could be the solicitor's office, it could be the PTAB, or it could be the USPTO examiners. But I think it's a completely different sphere in terms of knowing how it's actually run internally, what makes everybody tick and all of that. And I think those things do help if you're a practicing patent attorney, but it's a different level of knowledge of what makes the patent office tick the way it does. And of course, different administrations, right? Some patent offices are run pretty heavily handed from the White House, from the Commerce Department, and for others, it's more of a hands-off thing and how to navigate the Capitol Hill and all of that. So I think one is like the operation of the office itself, and then really this kind of know what makes the patent office tick. And I put it in one rubric. The other rubric is actually closely related to that second part that I discussed, but really knowing and being comfortable with the political landscape and the players involved with it on the Capitol Hill and within the administration and so forth. I guess the usual kind of model for a USPTO director, at least what we've seen in the last few administrations, is that a USPTO director was chosen who, I guess maybe with the exception of David Kapos, who weren't intimately involved in the patent policy developments or process or knew who the player was on all that. And then they quickly get surrounded by, I guess you'd call them political operatives, people who mostly have campaign backgrounds or so forth, but they're being placed as minors and watchers for the administrations and whatever the role that is as a chief of staff or a communication advisor. And that's the team that the USPTO director walks in, and he has to rely on them a lot, right? He has to rely on them to help him run the patent office and do whatever their official role is, but also, I guess, to deal with the rest of administration. The issue is that a lot of times these political operatives have very limited knowledge of the patent system, but also broader, like the IP ecosystem and even the policy side, right? And, the director, they usually have that IP or patent perspective on that, and they have that knowledge, but then you got to bridge it between kind of that with their experience in navigating Washington, D.C. So I guess those are two of the main things that I've thought about. One is they have to know how the USPTO operates inside and out. And two, they need to be comfortable with the political landscape and know how that works as well. And I think Coke Morgan Stewart exemplified, I think, on both counts. She spent over 10 years at the USPTO in very senior leadership roles. So she knows inside and out. She worked with different offices, different departments. When I interviewed the chairs of a AI working group, Deputy Commissioner Charlie Kim mentioned her because he actually started that working group with her, and he had such a positive experience. That's when she was back in civil service. So she knows it inside and out how that agency operates, who the people are involved, and she can hit the ground running from day one. The other thing is obviously she has that political background. She worked in the Youngkin administration, issues beyond IP and patents, I believe in the Attorney General office. But either way, she worked and she knows that. And she has a deep-seated interest in policy and patent policy issues. That's somebody who's ready to do the job from day one and ready to make a positive impact. So I think that's why she really stood out. Another piece about the fact that she worked at USPTO for 10 years, I think one of the things that I've heard from the USPTO officials over the last 2 years is when Kathy Vidal came in, and I'm a huge fan of her, and as speaking of a podcast and on a personal level. But when she came in, obviously the White House had a heavy-handed role in what the USPTO did. But on top of that, from within the USPTO, all the senior leadership positions were all of a sudden people were being brought in from the outside for civil servant positions. So I'm not even talking about the political roles, but I'm talking about the commissioner of patents. This was historically always a long time. Somebody who started at the USPTO from 30 years, started out as an examiner, somebody like that, who started in that role. And that person was very effective at being an intermediary between the director and the USPTO and knowing how things worked and implementing it and being able to provide the guidance and feedback to the director about what makes sense and what doesn't. And other roles as well, all the leadership roles and policy and so forth were that. Now, and this is something I actually talked to Kathy Dahl when I interviewed her, the Commissioner of Patents, the Commissioner of Trademarks, the new position of Chief Policy Officers were all people were brought from outside the patent office. They never worked in any capacity in the patent office before they joined. And actually, if you look at the leadership that was at the PTO, from a director, for a deputy director, and so forth, none of those people had any experience working at the USPTO. There were professors brought in for all kinds of senior positions, but nobody who spent their time as an examiner, not a single patent examiner, as far as I know, had one of those very senior roles. And it was demoralizing. That's the kind of the word that I heard. It was demoralizing for the examiners. Hey, these people all of a sudden, they're coming up with all this new stuff. They have all these new ideas. They're throwing out all this stuff left and right. And it was demoralizing to see your work, which you thought was impactful, effective, being thrown out. It was also demoralizing, new plans being put in that weren't maybe not very well thought through and not taking into account those who were at the patent office for a long time. I've talked to some of these people who are involved in having to work on these regulations or whatever. They didn't seem very too enthused. Coke Morgan Stewart, she was there for 10 years, and she was one of them. She was one of the 10 people. She was one of the people at USPTO, and she served there. So I think it's more than she intimately familiar with how it operates. She was there on the kind of ground level and doing that and making things happen. And every single person that I know that worked with her at the USPTO has nothing but positive things to say about her, from all kinds of people with different, very political views and views on patent policy and so forth. The other thing is, I know her, she really, really cares about the role of the patent system, about innovation and making sure that America prospers. And I've seen the way she not only discusses these issues, but, she relates to different people from different backgrounds. Obviously, people that she knows in very senior roles in government from with different points of view, different stakeholders and so forth, but also to everybody from inventors to practicing patent attorneys and so forth. She really cares. And, she's just a very genuine and nice person. It's just refreshing to think that somebody like that will be in that role. And I can't imagine a better choice. She's better than we could hope and expect from many administrations. Call what you want, a good judgment, a mini miracle, but it's great that she's in these roles. And I think Howard Lutnick, and this is what my last episode was devoted to. Howard Lutnick, Kenneth Fitzgerald, he had this somewhat unique appreciation for patents and what was that stemmed from. And David Bounty shared the story that actually it stemmed from the fact that Howard Lutnick, after 9/11 happened, most of the employees of that company were murdered by terrorists in the 9/11 attack. But Howard Lutnick rebuilt that company, and he credited the patent system for allowing them to do that. So it's a kind of a more personal than just being a business tool or from a economic perspective. To him, it's a real personal connection that he has with the patent system. But I'm sure that he'll find a kindred spirit in Coke. I know that she'll be somebody that he'll enjoy working with and could trust and rely on. So I want to talk a little bit about what the focus is, but I guess I want to take a moment in time to maybe go back in time before the previous administration. When Kathy Dahl was first nominated to be the director during the last administration, she was attacked for being the Silicon Valley litigator who would only care about the interests of big tech companies. And because I interviewed her for Clause 8 before that, a lot of people asked me about that. And I said I don't think that was quite fair. But what I also said was that I don't think it really matters who the USPTO director will be that much, because, and I think the patent community over focuses on that, because at the end of the day, patent policy is going to be run out of the White House, and they're going to control what the USPTO is going to do. And the real question is, where are they going to land on patent policy? And obviously, drug pricing became a huge issue, and patents became the bogeyman for that, and drove all the White House thinking on patent policy, which in turn caused the USPTO to issue this barrage of endless proposals to try to kind of weaken patent rights and making it harder to obtain and enforce patents. But what I didn't anticipate was that all these other things were going to go wrong because of what was going on at the USPTO, because they were so distracted with everything except the core function of examining patent applications that all of these other things, besides these new policies being pushed from the USPTO, would go wrong. So I guess I kind of want to talk a bit about what I think the major issues that the next USPTO director should focus on, and why Coke is particularly well suited to do that. First, I think the major issue is really the record levels of backlog of unexamined and pending patent applications. It's the highest the levels have been since Director Kapos took over back in 2008. I took a look at some of the statistics. Even after some of the artificial measures that PTO put in at the end of the last administration, the pendency for a patent application increased from 14.7 months to the first office action in 2020 to now more than 20 months. And then the total pendency, not just for the first office action, but the total pendency increased from less than 24 months in 2020 to now almost 30 months. But I think even more troubling than the numbers themselves is really some of the reasons behind the explosion. And I think the main reason for that is really that the office shifted from encouraging examiners to focus on performing the best prior art search possible, and then working with applicants to really figure out what is the fair patent rights that they should have through interviews and so forth, to really focusing on finding these weird ways to reject claims and so forth, and to push that guidance down on examiners. And that's where the barrage of guidance came from. And examiners were like, new training every week, new stuff that the USPTO forced them to figure out how to apply that probably wasn't perfectly well thought out. And so instead of examiners spending their time of searching for the best prior art and figuring out how to fairly apply that prior art, they were forced to deal with the latest guidance. And I think that probably effectively even lowered the quality of the allowed patent applications, because examiners didn't have that time to find the best and apply prior art because they were dealing with all these other things. And on top of that, applicants obviously had to do things that probably weren't justified just to get these applications allowed. At the same time, as part of all that, the fact that the USPTO decided to get rid of some of the programs that were designed for applicants and examiners to work together was actually quite revealing. And to be fair, some of these programs, like the ACP program and the First Action Pilot program, probably needed some improvements. But really the message that they sent is that the USPTO values examiners taking the time to work with applicants to expedite prosecution. And by focusing instead of getting rid of these programs is really part of a bigger message that was being sent to the examiners, that we don't want you to waste too much time on that, working with applicants. And obviously that translated into how, I guess, the examination took longer and was more difficult for examiners and applicants outside of these programs. And I think that was all part of this kind of approach and this attitude towards patent examination, which obviously caused the backlog to explode. And it's sort of a bit of a Groundhog Day, like I mentioned, because the situation of record backlogs is what David Kapos walked into when he became director. And he really focused on ways to encourage examiners to work with applicants. And a lot of those ideas that I mentioned came from that, and at least some of those people who helped David Kapos fix that are still at the USPTO. And I'm sure Coke Morgan Stewart knows a lot of them because she worked with them when she was at the USPTO. So I think she has a real advantage in that she knows these people and they know and like her and they trust her. And she will be well suited to do what David Kapos did and get that buy-in from everybody at the USPTO for that. The second huge problem that I think the USPTO really needs to tackle is really the explosion of the Section 1 panel majority rejections. Obviously, that was a huge problem after Alice came out, and Director Yanku helped solve that by releasing the revised 2019 guidance. But now, if you look at the statistics, when I last looked at the data, more than 24% of office actions issued by the USPTO now have 101 rejections, which is almost 10% higher than in the beginning of this administration. And this explosion is particularly noticeable actually in the art units that deal with AI inventions. For example, on Voice of IP, I broke the news that the main art unit that deals with AI technology, the 101 rejections went from 38% to almost 80% last year. And that's now spreading to other art units that deal with similar technologies. So it's obviously AI has been a big focus as we've talked on this podcast. And the last administration and the last USPTO, we talked a lot about the importance of AI, and they've made some positive strides with that. But at the same time, because of these 101 rejections in particular, it became much more difficult to obtain patents for AI, and particularly to improvements to AI itself, to the AI technology, to machine learning. And examiners were being sent very mixed messages about that, including additional guidance that came out. And a lot of the examiners that I've talked to, the message that they received was, you should strongly consider 101, and you don't want to end up with quote-unquote getting in trouble for failing to reject anything related to AI under 101. And again, this is kind of a way that Coke is the right person to fix that, is because actually the reason she helped start the working group in the first place under Yanko, the AI working group, was because she was to deal with the AI patent eligibility issues. And she helped develop some of those examples, the main example that came out regarding AI during that time. It really helped applicants and examiners understand that inventions that are all related about AI technology and to improvements in AI technology should be patent eligible. So again, in many ways, she's well suited to tackle that 101 problem. Another issue is like PTAB, like I mentioned. Again, the PTAB reverted to its high rates of institution. I think it's very unhealthy for the system to have this back and forth on that. And I think it makes sense to see if there's a way forward, obviously, which has been pushback on the FinTIF factors. And I guess we'll maybe get court decisions with regards to that. It might have an impact on that. But I think but PTAB operates, I think that's a big issue from both having faith in the patent system and so forth and how that's presented. Another huge advantage that Coke has is that she did work for the solicitor's office. So that really gives her a higher level vantage point on some of these issues over the long term, how the courts might deal and interpret with some of these things that the USPTO does in terms of director review and so forth, and implement them in a way this time around that they'll stick, right? And obviously the best way to make them stick is through congressional action. I won't get too much into the weeds on that. We did see some progress with the PTAB bill Prevail 101 and PARA. In this Congress, we see a lot of Tillis and Coons coming back, dealing with the Senate side. The House is less clear with ISA. But the one thing that I heard from the people involved in the process of trying to get these bills passed is that they weren't getting any backup from the USPTO, right? And it's helpful for the USPTO to say, hey, we have a huge 101 problem legislation. We need to pass legislation to get control. It's unrealistic for the examiners to work within the framework that we currently have. If a framework we currently have, it's going to actually lead to worse examination of patents, a less reliable patent system. 101, but also on the PTAB, the Prevail stuff, bringing in some of the standards that they use at the USPTO in terms of challenging patents, the PTAB can't be used in the way that the courts can be used, that it shouldn't be this avenue for kind of aggressively challenging patents. So those issues on the Prevail side are other issues. And, I think that's an important role for the next director to play. Like I said, Coke Morgan Stewart is intimately familiar with these issues. She knows those who have been involved in working on them on the Hill and elsewhere, and she'll be uniquely suited to bring all these different stakeholders together. I think she definitely has the right personality to do that. Everybody who knows her, met her, thinks she's awesome. So I think that's the kind of person you want in that, and you want to help usher that, especially for IP issues. Nothing's going to come law unless there's permanently broad consensus if these issues are elevated, but also somebody who kind of helps push back on some of the bad ideas that we see coming away from the Hill, including, which made it to the, scarily enough, made it to the end of funding bill that never got passed, but Bernie Sanders' proposal to replace patents with awards and prizes. And this has been a long time hobby horse of his, and he put it in the bill for the National Science Foundation, I believe, to study that as a way to build momentum towards that. He's obviously, I believe, he's chair of the Budget Committee, so he has a powerful role in the Senate in terms of what goes into going into those end-of-year bills. But also, I don't think there was nobody in administration minded. Every administration really minded that, and there was no effective pushback on that from the USPTO. So I think that's another important role to play. And somebody, I guess, being liked is helpful with that. We saw that Rubio hit a confirmation of 99-0. So even in this day and age, you could be liked by senators from across the aisle, within parties and so forth. There's room for that, and you want to position somebody to do that, to have a background and do that. So I guess I just want to end this by wishing Coke Morgan Stewart all the best in her days ahead at the USPTO. I know people at the USPTO are excited. I know people in the patent community are excited. I know stakeholders who believe in innovation and who believe in America's patent system are excited to see what she will do there. Particularly those who know her best are maybe as giddy as I am about the improvements that we will see at the USPTO. But I also hope that the administration, like I said, nominates her for that as director, so that she now leads the role, even in the acting role, with the viewpoint of being really able to have that latitude, have a time to make the changes that are necessary, that are long-term, and that she can build consensus around, and that hopefully can last longer than this one administration. So thank you for listening to Clause 8. We'll be back with interviews soon, and we'll have more exciting news about the next season of Clause 8. But thanks again for listening. And obviously, as always, let me know what you think. You can email me at Eli, @voiceofip.com. I always love to hear what you have to think, or connect with me on LinkedIn. But yeah, definitely, and share this with others. I would appreciate that. Like I said, I do this, and it brings me a lot of joy to hear about others listening to it. So if you could do that, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.